Young man saves tiger cub. What happened next shocked the village. In the rugged wilderness of northern Montana, where the Rocky Mountains cast long shadows over valleys dotted with small towns and sprawling ranches, 24-year-old Jake Harrison lived a life that straddled two worlds. By day, he worked as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist at Pine Creek Wildlife Haven, and by night, he pored over his late father's veterinary journals, trying to absorb every bit of wisdom left behind in those well-worn pages. Pine Creek, with its population of just under 2,000 souls, was the kind of place where change came slowly, if at all, and traditions were held as sacred as Sunday church services. Jake's father, Dr. Thomas Harrison, had been more than just the town's most respected veterinarian. He had been a visionary who believed in the delicate balance between human development and wildlife conservation. His sudden passing 3 years ago from a heart attack had left a void in both the community and Jake's life that seemed impossible to fill. The wildlife sanctuary they had built together was his father's legacy, one of the few certified facilities in Montana equipped to handle large predators, though their usual charges were more modest. Injured deer, orphaned elk calves, and the occasional black bear cub. Living alone in his father's old cabin on the outskirts of town, Jake had developed a routine that kept him busy enough to avoid dwelling on his loss. The cabin itself was a testament to his father's philosophy, built to coexist with nature rather than dominate it. Solar panels provided power, a natural spring supplied water, and the garden his mother had planted before her death a decade ago still produced vegetables in the warmer months. It was a life that made sense to Jake, even if the loneliness sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. The spring of 2024 had arrived early, bringing with it unusual warmth and the first stirrings of new life in the forest. Jake had been tracking reports of illegal exotic animal trading in the region, a growing problem that had law enforcement increasingly concerned. Wealthy collectors were paying top dollar for exotic pets, leading to a dangerous underground market that often resulted in abandoned or abused animals when their owners realized they couldn't handle them. It was during one of his early morning patrols that Jake's life took an unexpected turn. He had received a tip from Marcus Wheeler, a local hunter known for his keen eye and respect for wildlife, about strange sounds and suspicious activity in a remote area of the forest. The morning air was crisp and heavy with the scent of pine as Jake made his way through the undergrowth, his boots crushing last autumn's leaves beneath them. The forest was awakening around him. Chickadees called from the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed its morning rhythm. But it was another sound that stopped Jake in his tracks, a weak, desperate mewling that seemed entirely out of place in the Montana wilderness. His heart began to race as he recognized the sound as something definitely not native to these woods. Following the distressed cries, Jake pushed through a thick patch of mountain laurel, his experienced eyes scanning the ground for signs of human activity. What he found made his blood run cold. A tiger cub, no more than 2 months old, was tangled in a crude snare. The poor creature's orange and black coat, which should have been vibrant and glossy, was dull and matted. Despite its obvious distress, what struck Jake most were the cub's eyes, a startling, almost impossible shade of blue that seemed to pierce right through him. "Dear God," Jake whispered, his breath catching in his throat. In all his years of wildlife rescue, he had never encountered anything like this. The cub was severely dehydrated and malnourished, its small frame showing signs of neglect. With trembling hands, Jake reached for his satellite phone to call both the sanctuary and local authorities. This was evidence of something much bigger and more sinister than they had suspected. As he waited for backup, Jake began the delicate process of assessing the cub's condition. The snare hadn't caused any severe physical injury, but the psychological trauma was evident in the way the small tiger flinched at his approach. Drawing on years of experience and everything his father had taught him about gaining an animal's trust, Jake began speaking in soft, soothing tones. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, slowly removing supplies from his backpack. "I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me." The cub's blue eyes followed his every movement, and despite its fear, there was an intelligence in that gaze that touched something deep within Jake's soul. Without really meaning to, he found himself naming her Azure, though he knew the dangers of getting emotionally attached to a rescue animal. The news of Jake's discovery spread through Pine Creek with the speed of a summer wildfire. By the time he arrived back at the sanctuary with the cub carefully secured in a transport carrier, a crowd had gathered. Among them was Eleanor Matthews, a prominent member of the town council known for her conservative views and resistance to change. Her presence, with arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line, suggested that the real challenges were just beginning. "This is absolute madness, Jake Harrison," Eleanor declared, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "A tiger? In Pine Creek? Have you completely lost your mind? This isn't some stray cat you can nurse back to health. It's a dangerous predator that could grow to be hundreds of pounds." Jake understood the concerns. They were valid, after all. But he also knew that Azure's situation was dire. The nearest facility equipped to handle tigers was overwhelmed and couldn't take her for at least 2 months. Without immediate intervention, the cub wouldn't survive. "Mrs. Matthews," Jake responded, trying to keep his voice level despite his exhaustion. "I understand your concerns, but this is exactly the kind of situation my father built this sanctuary for. Azure will be in a secure enclosure, and this is temporary until we can transfer her to a permanent facility." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt something shifting inside him. The connection he had felt with Azure in the forest was growing stronger, and somehow he knew that this rescue would be different from all the others. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. The following days were a blur of intense activity. Sarah Chun, the sanctuary's experienced veterinarian who had worked alongside Jake's father for years, helped develop a comprehensive care plan for Azure. The cub required round-the-clock attention, with bottle feeding every few hours and constant monitoring of her condition. Jake practically moved into the sanctuary, setting up a cot in the medical wing to be near Azure during the crucial first weeks. During those long nights, as he cradled the tiny tiger and coaxed her to take formula from a bottle, he often found himself talking to her about his father. "You would have liked him," he told her one night, watching as she finally began to show interest in her surroundings. "Dad always said that every animal has a story to tell if we're willing to listen. I wonder what your story is, little one." Sarah observed Jake's dedication with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're so much like your father," she said one evening as they changed Azure's bedding. "He had that same look in his eyes whenever he found an animal that needed saving. But Jake, you know we can't keep her forever, right?" Jake nodded, though the thought of sending Azure away already caused an ache in his chest. "I know, but right now she needs us, and maybe we need her too." As Azure grew stronger, Jake began documenting her recovery on social media. What started as simple progress updates quickly caught the attention of people far beyond Pine Creek. Videos of Azure learning to play with enrichment toys and mastering basic behaviors went viral, and suddenly the sanctuary's social media followers grew from a few hundred to several thousand. The increased attention brought both support and scrutiny. While many people were moved by Azure's story and offered donations to support her care, others sided with Eleanor Matthews in expressing concern about the safety implications of having a tiger in their small town. The debate reached such intensity that the town council called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. The town hall was packed on the night of the meeting, with residents spilling out onto the sidewalk. Jake had prepared a presentation, complete with documentation of Azure's progress and the sanctuary's safety protocols. But he knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough to win over his neighbors' hearts. When it was his turn to speak, Jake took a deep breath and thought of his father. "I know many of you are scared," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I understand that fear, but I also know that we have a choice to make, not just about Azure, but about who we want to be as a community." He shared photos and videos of Azure's recovery, explaining how the investigation into her origins had led to the arrest of 3 wildlife traffickers operating in the area. He detailed the sanctuary's perfect safety record and the protocols in place to ensure both animal and human safety. But most importantly, he spoke from his heart about the responsibility humans had to right the wrongs they'd done to animals like Azure. "My father used to say that the true measure of a community isn't just how we treat our friends and neighbors, but how we treat the most vulnerable among us," Jake continued. Azure didn't ask to be born into captivity. She didn't ask to be trafficked or abandoned in our forest. But now that she's here, we have a choice to make. We can turn our backs because she's inconvenient, or we can show the world that Pine Creek is a place where compassion and courage still mean something. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Then, from the back of the room, a small voice spoke up. It was Emily Parker, a 10-year-old girl who had been visiting Azure regularly with her class as part of the sanctuary's educational program. "Azure isn't scary," Emily declared, standing on her chair to be seen. "She's brave and strong, and she makes me want to be brave too. Please don't make her leave." Emily's words seemed to break a dam. Other residents began sharing their own experiences with the sanctuary and their observations of how Azure's presence had affected the community. Local teachers spoke about how their students' interest in conservation had increased. Business owners noted the uptick in visitors to the town. Even some of the initial skeptics admitted that the sanctuary's handling of Azure had been professional and transparent. As support began to grow, the sanctuary received requests from local schools about establishing educational programs. Children sent drawings of Azure to the sanctuary, and local artists created murals celebrating wildlife conservation. The local newspaper ran a feature story that was picked up by regional media, bringing even more attention to Pine Creek and its unusual resident. Azure's growth was remarkable, both physically and in terms of her personality. Though she maintained her wild nature, she showed an extraordinary capacity for learning and adaptation. Jake worked tirelessly to ensure she would develop properly, neither too tame nor too wild, always keeping in mind that she would eventually need to transition to a permanent facility. But fate had other plans. 6 months into Azure's rehabilitation, Jake received devastating news. The facility that had agreed to take Azure had lost its funding and was closing. Other sanctuaries were full, and time was running out. Azure was growing rapidly, and soon she would be too big for their temporary facilities. The news hit the community hard. Over the months, Azure had become more than just a rescued tiger. She had become a symbol of transformation for Pine Creek. Even Eleanor Matthews, who had been so opposed initially, had been won over after seeing the positive impact Azure's presence had on the town's youth and economy. It was Eleanor who surprised everyone by calling another emergency town council meeting. But this time, the agenda was different, discussing the possibility of expanding Pine Creek Wildlife Haven to include a permanent big cat facility. The proposal was ambitious. It would require significant funding, permits, and community support. But as Eleanor pointed out, the sanctuary had already proven itself capable of handling such a responsibility. Sometimes, Eleanor addressed the packed town hall, we need to be reminded that the most rewarding paths are often the most challenging. Azure has taught our community about courage, compassion, and change. Perhaps it's time we showed the same courage in return. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The community rallied together in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year before. Local businesses organized fundraisers, schools held penny drives, and the town's tech-savvy teenagers created a viral social media campaign that attracted attention from major news outlets. Architecture firms offered pro bono services for designing state-of-the-art enclosures, and construction companies provided discounted materials and labor. Environmental organizations and wildlife experts from across the country offered guidance and support, impressed by the small town's commitment to doing things right. Jake worked tirelessly, coordinating with experts across the country to ensure their new facility would meet the highest standards of animal care. He thought often of his father during this time, imagining his pride at seeing the sanctuary evolve in ways they had only dreamed about. The long days and sleepless nights were exhausting, but every time he saw Azure's blue eyes watching him, he found renewed energy to continue. The transformation of Pine Creek Wildlife Haven took nearly a year to complete. The new facility included spacious, naturalistic enclosures designed specifically for big cats, though Azure would be their only resident for the foreseeable future. The project had brought the community together in unexpected ways, creating bonds that transcended initial fears and prejudices. Local artists collaborated to create educational exhibits about wildlife conservation and the illegal exotic pet trade. The sanctuary developed comprehensive educational programs for schools, and college students began applying for internships. What had started as one man's effort to save a single tiger cub had evolved into a model for community-based wildlife conservation. On the day of the new facility's opening, Jake stood before a crowd that included not just locals, but visitors from across the country who had followed Azure's story. The little cub he had found in the forest had grown into a magnificent young tigress, her blue eyes still as striking as ever. When I found Azure that morning, Jake addressed the gathering, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I was saving her life. What I didn't realize was that she would end up saving something in all of us. She reminded us that sometimes the things we fear the most are the very things that can bring out the best in us. Azure's story continued to inspire long after the opening ceremony. The sanctuary began receiving requests to help other big cats in need, and while they couldn't save them all, they were able to make a difference where they could. Jake established educational programs that taught children about wildlife conservation and the importance of protecting endangered species. The town of Pine Creek was transformed as well. What had once been a quiet, traditional community became known as a model for wildlife conservation and community cooperation. Tourism increased, bringing new opportunities and perspectives to the area. The sanctuary's success sparked similar initiatives in other small towns across the country. The impact rippled out in unexpected ways. Other communities began reaching out to Pine Creek for guidance on handling their own wildlife challenges. Jake found himself traveling to speak at conferences, sharing the story of how one tiger cub had transformed an entire town. He always made sure to emphasize that the real hero of the story wasn't him, but the community that had chosen to open its heart to something different. Sarah Chun, who had been there from the beginning, perhaps summed it up best during an interview with National Geographic. What happened in Pine Creek isn't just about saving wildlife. It's about the power of compassion to transform communities. When Jake brought Azure to us that morning, none of us could have imagined how she would change our lives. She taught us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is be brave enough to care. Eleanor Matthews, now serving as the chairperson of the sanctuary's board of directors, became one of its most vocal advocates. I was wrong about Azure, she admitted during a town hall meeting celebrating the sanctuary's expansion. I was so focused on what could go wrong that I couldn't see what could go right. This experience has taught me that sometimes the things that shock us most are the things that change us for the better. As for Jake and Azure, their bond only grew stronger with time. While she remained very much a wild animal, there was an understanding between them that transcended words. On quiet evenings, Jake would often sit near her enclosure, watching as she patrolled her territory with regal grace. In those moments, he would remember the tiny, frightened cub he had found in the forest, and marvel at how saving one life had changed so many others. The story of the young man who saved a tiger cub continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of Pine Creek. It served as a reminder that the most profound changes often begin with a single act of compassion, and that even in the most unlikely circumstances, hope and love could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Years later, visitors to Pine Creek Wildlife Haven would still pause to read the plaque outside Azure's enclosure, which bore a simple but powerful message. Every act of kindness ripples through time, changing hearts and minds in ways we may never fully understand. Azure's story is not just about saving a tiger. It's about the transformation that happens when we choose compassion over fear. And on quiet mornings, when the sun was just rising over the Montana mountains, Jake would still marvel at those striking blue eyes that had changed his life forever, grateful for the twist of fate that had led him into the forest that spring morning, and the courage to believe that one person's compassion could indeed change the world. The legacy of Jake and Azure's story continues to inspire new generations of conservationists and animal lovers. The Pine Creek Wildlife Haven became more than just a sanctuary. It evolved into a leading research center for wildlife rehabilitation and conservation education. 10 years after finding Azure, Jake established the Thomas Harrison Memorial Scholarship, named after his father, which provided funding for aspiring veterinarians and wildlife conservationists. The program specifically focused on students from small towns who dreamed of making a difference in wildlife conservation but lacked the resources to pursue their education. Azure's presence continued to have unexpected positive effects on the community. Local artists and craftspeople began creating wildlife-themed artwork and products, establishing Pine Creek as a destination for eco-conscious tourists. The annual Azure Festival, celebrating wildlife conservation and community unity, became one of Montana's most popular spring events, drawing visitors from across the country. The sanctuary's success also led to partnerships with major universities and research institutions. Scientists came to study Azure and the unique relationship she had developed with the community. Their research helped develop new protocols for wildlife rehabilitation and community-based conservation efforts. Emily Parker, the young girl who had spoken up at that crucial town meeting years ago, grew up to become the sanctuary's lead educational coordinator after completing her degree in wildlife biology. She often told visitors how Azure had inspired her career choice, and how one tiger's story had shown her that even the smallest voice could make a difference. Eleanor Matthews, in her later years, wrote a memoir titled Learning to Change: How a Tiger Taught a Town to Roar. The book became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a documentary, spreading Pine Creek's story to an even wider audience. As Azure entered her golden years, she remained the heart and soul of the sanctuary. Though other rescued big cats had joined her over the years, her unique blue eyes and remarkable story continued to captivate visitors. She had long since been joined by other tigers, lions, and even a few mountain lions, each with their own story of rescue and redemption. Jake, now in his 40s, had married Sarah Chen's daughter, Michelle, who shared his passion for wildlife conservation. Together, they expanded the sanctuary's programs and influence, never forgetting the special tiger who had started it all. On Azure's 15th birthday, the sanctuary hosted a special celebration. Hundreds of people gathered to honor the tiger who had changed their lives. Among them were many of the children, now adults, who had grown up visiting her, learning about conservation through her story, and being inspired to pursue careers in wildlife protection. The most touching moment came when Marcus Wheeler, the hunter who had first tipped Jake off about the strange sounds in the forest, stood to speak. Now in his 80s, his voice still carried the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime in nature. Some folks might say it was just chance that Jake found that tiger cub that morning, he said, his voice wavering with emotion. But I believe it was something more. It was a reminder that we're all connected: humans, animals, and the wild places we share. Azure didn't just need saving that day. We needed her to save us from forgetting that truth. As the sun set on that celebration, Jake stood by Azure's enclosure, reflecting on the journey they had shared. The frightened cub he had found in the forest had grown into a magnificent creature who had helped transform not just a town, but countless lives. Her story had become a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the unexpected ways that love could bridge the gap between humans and wildlife. And so, the story of the young man who saved a tiger cub became more than just a tale of rescue. It became a legacy of hope, a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single act of kindness, and that when we open our hearts to helping others, we often discover that we are the ones being saved. The plaque outside Azure's enclosure was eventually expanded to include these words: "In saving her, we saved ourselves. In loving her, we learned to love our better natures. And in choosing compassion over fear, we discovered that the greatest transformations often begin with the smallest acts of kindness." And that is how a tiger cub with blue eyes changed not just a village, but the hearts and minds of people across the nation, proving that sometimes the most shocking things in life are the ones that teach us the most about who we truly are and who we can become.